Yeah.
All right. It's 2 o'clock, and since we were just chatting here with the group about how Zoom and video meetings seem to start on time, we will jump in as well. So thanks everybody who has joined us and has been joining us for these chats. I'm going to quickly introduce the folks on screen. We've done these as a mix of in our office, and we've always tried to, in terms of having some geographic diversity and so forth, had people coming in from Europe and elsewhere, and we were intending to make this one all virtual, and now we've had to make it all virtual, and I think it actually seems to work well. So thanks to everybody who's taking a break from work video conferences and so forth to be with us. We are delighted that today we are looking at, I think this is going to appear flipped to you guys. No, it looks flipped to me, but it's actually direct to you guys. Okay, we'll ask some more technical person to explain why that happens. So we're talking today about the ethical algorithm. Hopefully you all purchased a copy. And if you didn't, because I know sometimes people are caught up but still want to join the chat, I recommend that you do, because this is actually going on my shelf, not only as a good read, but almost as a, I won't say a reference book, but there are some portions here that I probably am going to need to refer to, especially when we do some work around policy issues around AI. So really delighted that we have with us the two authors, Professor Michael Kearns and Professor Aaron Roth. Michael, as some of you know, probably from some of his earlier work, Michael, we were on a panel together when you released a paper about search algorithms, data algorithms. It was at the AT&T conference center.
Oh yeah, yeah.
You see, I made a big impression on him. Well, he was the keynote. We then just were chewing over his paper. Michael is the professor and the National Center Chair in Computer and Information Science at University of Pennsylvania, and also has appointments in economics at the Wharton School, and has published about a wide range of machine learning, AI, game theory, quantitative finance. Professor Aaron Roth is an associate professor at University of Pennsylvania. I actually first became aware of Aaron because I noticed his work and writing on de-identification and differential privacy, and enjoyed following that. So let me quickly ask the rest of our in-studio guests here to introduce themselves with a brief, description of their job. They are here because we wanted to guarantee that some smart folks actually read the book, and but you all who are joining virtually are equally entitled to speak up and chat, either in the Zoom webinar, or we're happy to pop your window here and make sure that everybody can see. So don't hesitate to raise questions, and I'll either raise it or we're more than happy to have you chat yourself. This is informal. It's a book club. It's not a presentation. So Alyssa, let me start with you, and then we'll go to Michael and Aaron and ask them a little bit about what was behind this book. Alyssa?
Hi, I'm Alyssa Benton. I'm a fellow at the Future of Privacy Forum and a recent graduate of Georgetown Law.
Sarah?
Hi, I'm Sarah DePaul. I'm the Senior Director for Technology Policy at the Software and Information Industry Association.
Eric?
Yeah, I'm Eric Lamy. I work for MediaMath as a product manager in data solutions and consumer privacy.
And Chloe?
Hi everyone, I'm Chloe Audio, and I'm working the government policy group on privacy and AI issues, especially on responsible AI at Intel.
Great. And Rob?
Hi everyone, my name is Rob van Eyck. I recently joined FPF, and I'm basically the man in Brussels for FPF. I'm following all the news there, and before joining FPF, I worked for the Dutch Data Protection Authority for nearly 10 years.
Great. So let's jump in. So before we opened up, I couldn't resist starting to ask Michael and Aaron. This I thought was a unusual book. It's not a heavy-duty academic publication, but it's not a light sort of here's what algorithms are mean to society type quick entertaining the broad public. It's accessible, but you gotta read carefully. And I think for us, not certainly probably a majority of us here right now who are lawyers, it was enormously useful because it was a discussion and description of a lot of the the cases and the criticisms that one has seen, but really goes through them in a real structured, interesting way. So what, clearly you weren't planning on, writing a sort of bestseller for the mass public to be sold at, to be on Oprah's book club, although it would be a good selection for that. But it clearly has a lot of the, it's a substantive, technical and intellectual contribution. What was your thinking, or what part of the market does a book like this hit? Because it hit our market perfectly, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, Aaron, maybe I'll go and then you can follow up. If that's okay. We're pretty good at tag teaming these days. Yeah, so you're exactly right. We definitely kind of knew we were trying to thread some sort of needle with this book. The original genesis of it, I think, is really in our research. So we, like many people, on the one hand, had been seeing more and more popular books like Weapons of Math Destruction come out that we thought did a very good job at identifying the very real problems with algorithmic decision making. But we also felt, as researchers in the field, that when those books kind of came to their inevitable kind of solution section, we were sort of disappointed and felt that they were lacking, in the sense that they largely said things like, well, wow, this is a real problem. We need better laws. We need better regulations. We need watchdog groups, all of which we agree with. But, at the time we wrote the book, already for several years, we were part of a growing sub-community in the AI and machine learning research, community, that were working on algorithmic solutions, basically trying to make the algorithms better in the first place so that they avoid or reduce the kinds of ethical misbehaviors that we describe in the book. And so we knew we wanted to write a book which was described, not just kind of complaining, so to speak, but actually talking about the underlying science of designing better behaved algorithms. And so, we were, this is the first general audience book that either of us have written. We've both written technical books before. And, it was appealing to try it just because we were actively working on the underlying science. And I think we on the one hand, we would have been pleasantly surprised if it did turn out to be a national bestseller. But I think probably the people on this call are very representative of what our core goal was, right? Our core goal was not to describe the science to our peers, of course, but to reach a wider audience of people who really care about these things in their everyday lives, like legal scholars, policymakers, and the like. Aaron?
Yeah, so just to add a little bit to that, I think this question of who's the audience for this book is something that came up very early in our discussions about it, and we really weren't sure who it would be, and we sort of decided actually that we wanted to just go ahead and write the book that we wanted to write, and then kind of cross our fingers and hope that there'd be someone who wanted to read it. But our motivation was that there's all of this, we think, very interesting work around privacy and fairness and the other topics that we think about in the book, we talk about in the book, and spend our days sort of immersed in this, but writing for other academics, which is ultimately a very narrow audience. And we thought these were sort of interesting and important enough topics that they are, that they should be understood, at least at a high level, by a broader audience, not necessarily, like airport readers, but legal scholars and regulators and other people who are grappling with these issues. And so, on the one hand, we didn't want to dumb it down. Like, we actually wanted to sort of grapple with the ideas that are underlying things like differential privacy. But on the other hand, we did take pains to try to remove equations from the book. We sort of wanted to, we didn't want there to be too much of a startup cost. And so like the first draft of our chapters, had some math in them, and we tried to remove, I think in the end succeeded removing all of the actual equations. And
thank you for that.
Yeah, we hope though we didn't remove too many of the underlying ideas.
And what's been the reception? I mean, I never would have imagined that Shoshana Zuboff's book, would become this, rock star, reviewed in every, publication around the world. But the timing, the title, has anybody been, have you been surprised by sort of any of the audiences that found this interesting? I know you've been invited, and it's been reviewed and speaking. What's been your sense of the reaction, and any surprises for the audiences that have found it particularly interesting?
Yeah, I think so I think the reception's been very good, and we have been going around giving a lot of talks at both companies and conferences and the like. Just speaking for myself, I do think in many ways the most satisfying traction has been with this sort of broader group that we're trying to make our core audience, or that was, kind of the if in my mind I had a reader in my head as I was writing, it was for sort of the types of people on this call. So people who are in the technology world, maybe not like actually as an engineer or a scientist or a software developer or the like, but more on the policy side of things. I thought one of the most engaging talks we gave actually was about a month ago in New York to a group of Facebook advertising executives. So these are really people on the sales and marketing side of ads at Facebook. And they're very aware of a lot of the fairness issues we talk about. They're grappling with them, sort of in the HUD case that's coming up for them. About the potential for discriminatory behavior in housing advertising on Facebook. And, they were very thoughtful about it, and they really wanted to kind of know what was going on in the technical community. And also, one of their goals was just to be able to learn enough to be able to have a satisfying discussion about the issues with the clients of the Facebook advertising platform. So, that was one that I got a particular kick out of.
Eric, let me bring you in, since we cited advertising. Media Math is a leading ad tech company. So from somebody sitting on the side of having to worry about this, what did it speak to you from a kind of professional day-to-day world?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the places where consumers generally are getting more familiar with concepts around privacy is with their browsers, with the way that they access information online, whether that's through a mobile browser or through their traditional computers. And we grapple with those issues every single day. Anybody who's following the continuing saga of the third-party cookie, for instance, and the way that we are able to collect consumer information and identifiers on individuals across the web and process e-commerce transactions and to be able to pay back referrers and all of these different issues that affect the e-commerce vendors, will be very intimately familiar with how consumer privacy regulation and changes to the technology infrastructure that impact the way that consumer privacy, consumer data is treated, has an outsized impact on how our products need to function. So that's largely what my role is at Media Math, or a significant portion of it, is to understand what the landscape of the changes that are happening, largely driven by some of the browser vendors, whether that's the Mozilla Foundation or Google or Apple, who are implementing changes all the time that are striving to be more respectful proactively of consumer privacy, or just with the way that our end consumers are responding to the advertising they're seeing across the industry. And so it's definitely important for me personally, but it's also important to have books like this that don't speak to folks who are implementers, such as myself or the teams that I work with, but that are more accessible to that executive audience, because ultimately we need to be able to speak to the folks who are, setting the priorities for the business to say, hey, these are things that are very important to people, and the issues that we address from a privacy perspective in order to be best serving consumers, those are things that we should be leading on if we want to continue to be relevant players in the industry. So I think rather than it being something that we need to be viewing in ad tech or in e-commerce or just across the business world more generally, something that is preventing or putting up guardrails around what we can do and how we can serve our end consumers, it's really providing new opportunities for us to better serve those cohorts without sacrificing the need to be respectful of their privacy.
Let me bring in a question from the virtual audience here. No surprise tied to the current pandemic. Any lessons from you guys, or certainly from the algorithmic discrimination type debate? Governments and app developers and everybody is trying to figure out how to help, but how to maybe not do the wrong things. And any takeaways from any of the descriptions here, or from some of the problem use cases that you would want to warn data regulators or I don't know, epidemiologists who are launching apps around the world? We've seen everything from apps that are maybe privacy friendly. They keep all the data on the app, but they pull in maps that are made available of where people have been moving. Israel just released an app like that. And then you've seen apps, right, that alert the government and let them know if you've left your quarantine, or if you, or that text you to warn you you better go into quarantine. Any high level sort of warnings from the world of ethical algorithms?
Yeah, well, actually, I saw somebody in the chat, early on talking about the use of cell phone GPS data, to sort of track movements and interactions between people in service of fighting the coronavirus. And then coincidentally, I happen to be chatting with a friend who works for a large French consulting company that I will not name, who said that they were actually starting to do work for clients on that kind of thing, on sort of trying to get, cell phone tower and mobility data to help track the virus. And that I guess, there are extant laws in France that prevent this, that are actively trying to be, altered in short order for this. And I guess my only comment here would be one that, isn't particularly algorithmic in nature, but, the concern with these kinds of things is kind of like with 9/11 in the United States. There's some crisis, and you enact privacy changes or laws or policy changes for what might initially be a good reason, and then they stay around forever and find other misuses later on. And I think that would be the obvious concern with that sort of surveillance data and the kind of granular use of it in the near term, and the consequences of kind of changing such policies and laws for the longer term.
Yeah.
Question. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
And the only thing I would add is that, of course, there are big challenges with trying to do, contact tracing and sort of the kind of epidemiological investigation you need to do to stop something like the current pandemic in a way that preserves privacy. And some of these are unavoidable. Like one of the underlying messages, I think, from our book is that you always have to be dealing in trade-offs, that privacy doesn't come for free. And we have to reason as a society how we want to sort of differently weight our different desiderata. And, we might be right now at a place where privacy has relatively less weight in our objective function than it would otherwise. There are, of course, some tools for doing things like contact tracing, secure multi-party computation for computing private set differences. If we don't want to release publicly my entire location history, but I want to be able to figure out whether you and I have been in the same place. There are technical ways of doing that without publishing the data. But of course, as we talk about in the book a bit, these kinds of cryptographic solutions are good as far as they go, but they don't really address the full privacy problem.
Chloe, Sarah, can I bring either of you, both of you, in? What's any point you want to raise for our authors while they're with us?
Yeah, Sarah, unless you're itching to go, I can go ahead. And while I certainly have questions about, some of the biggest concerns that I immediately thought about, I think as we all are in this strange world we're living in. You started the book with talking about a brave new world and, sort of this golden age of data, and my head immediately went to coronavirus. So just for, I think, my sanity and maybe that of others, I'm going to try to ask questions that aren't related to that. Just because while it's so, relevant to everything that's going on right now, I had a few other questions that I found really interesting and sort of resonant as I was going through this book. So I just have a couple of high-level reactions. I just wanted to say thank you so much. This is one of the best pieces of literature I feel like I've read that really explains, as Jules said, these technical concepts in a way that is both tangible and really kind of dynamic and complex. I have an economics degree and really enjoyed sort of, and while I haven't been a practicing economist or never would have considered myself that way, I really enjoyed sort of getting back into, the game theory and some of the statistical terms and concepts that you applied here. So it was a really fun read for someone who hasn't sort of, dabbled in this area in a while. So based on, or sort of related,
Oh, did we just have Chloe freeze up?
Yeah, it looks like she got
Give
frozen.
her, let's give her 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, hopefully she will unfreeze. Sarah, we will go to you and swap back to Chloe when her Wi-Fi stabilizes. Or I'm going to start blaming Zoom. I cannot imagine that Zoom is competing with Microsoft and Google, right, who have these massive scale, businesses and can give away a lot of stuff for free because there's a bigger business model. Oh, Chloe, do we have you back? You are muted, and if you unmute.
Thanks. I guess the
You're back.
connectivity issues are plaguing all of us. Sorry about that. I don't know what the last thing I said was, but I realized that everyone froze.
The economics and statistics pieces of it were.
It was great. I'll jump right to my question. I really, just on the technical explanations, one of my question was, related to the discussion that you presented about, some of the technical explanations around privacy and fairness, and how fairness tends to be a little bit more messy. It's more of like a messy domain to sort of apply and study in this realm. And based on this messiness and the sort of surge and contrast we've seen in privacy innovation or privacy enhancing technologies, of which Jules is very familiar. I'm just wondering if you see a path where the messiness around some of this fairness or these algorithmic concepts for fairness or tools will shake out, and if we'll see the same sort of innovation and growth in fairness enhancing technologies as we're seeing lately with privacy enhancing technologies. So that was sort of one of my forthright questions.
Yeah, so I think so. Although I think it'll take a different path than we've seen privacy take. So my view is that sort of the academic literature, at least on fairness and machine learning, is maybe like 15 years behind where the literature on privacy is. And before differential privacy was proposed, the academic privacy landscape wasn't that different from what the fairness landscape looks like now, which is that there were sort of lots of competing definitions. Sort of people would propose definitions, other people would sort of point out problems with them, new definitions would be proposed, sort of trying to like patch up the problems with the old ones, but not really getting to the heart of the issue. And so we're sort of in that stage right now, I think, in the fairness and machine learning literature. There's this whole sort of zoo of definitions that are being proposed, and I don't think there are any right now that sort of are beyond reproach. Like all of them have, you know, real problems with them. On the other hand, you know, like I think that we won't reach a point where the landscape is as clean maybe as it is in privacy right now, in that, you know, in privacy we were sort of lucky that although differential privacy of course doesn't capture everything that we mean by privacy, it captures a pretty large chunk of what we mean in statistical scenarios. And I don't think we're going to get anything approaching like a single sort of sensible definition. In the fairness literature, we already know that there are sort of unavoidable trade-offs between different things we might mean by fairness. And so what I might hope is that in, you know, a few years, we're at a place where we have maybe a relatively small family of sort of well-motivated fairness definitions that have sort of meaningful semantics to individuals, and we are more comfortable talking about sort of the costs and trade-offs of these different definitions in relation to one another, and have the vocabulary to talk in a richer way about kinds of fairness.
Aaron, you mentioned differential privacy, and I was curious why the first part of the book is about differential privacy and or, you know, is significant portion on de-identification. And I said, well, Aaron is an expert on that and has sort of written about that. And I get obviously that, you know, if the data is going to be personal, that's you know, why we're going to worry about it. But I didn't expect that to be sort of the base. What was it your view that really was sort of the logical place to start because of the way the identification and what's personal sort of underlies a lot of the other questions that the ethical challenges build on?
Yes, we actually, I mean, we debated for a while about sort of the order of the chapters, and maybe initially, you know, we had the fairness chapter coming first. I think sort of the way we structured the book in the end is from sort of the sort of most established science to the most speculative science, or the earliest stage science. And so in relation to, for example, the fairness literature, the differential privacy literature is much better established. There's a lot more we know, and we wanted to sort of, I think we sort of lead off the book with sort of the most established science, and then we sort of gradually work our way to sort of more speculative stuff, ending with the, you know, with the last chapter where we even talk about, you know, concerns about the singularity in the last few pages.
Yeah, so in some ways it was the cleanest starting point to illustrate that you could actually, you know, embed well-defined social norms into the code of algorithms, right? And so I think that's kind of what motivated the starting point. A couple other comments just to Chloe's questions. You know, one of the things that I kind of didn't quite appreciate as we were writing the book, that I very much appreciated once we started talking about it, is that regardless of the relative technical maturity of studies of algorithm, you know, the sort of field of algorithmic fairness versus privacy, somehow there's something inherently political about discussions of fairness. So what I mean by that is, you know, different people have different attitudes towards privacy and how much they care about it and how much they think it's important to them or us as a society. But kind of in the abstract, everybody believes that, you know, kind of more privacy is better, all other things being equal, right? Whereas any definition of fairness that's in wide use, like the very first step you need to engage in is, what group is it that you're trying to protect? What would constitute a harm to that group? And then you immediately get into questions, well, why are you choosing to protect that group? You know, why should this racial minority, for instance, deserve explicit protections in the development of credit scoring models, for example? And then you find yourself unavoidably talking about things like affirmative action and whether you're doing these things to sort of make the world a better place now, or just to redress a past wrong by society and the like. And I don't, you know, no matter what technical state the study of fairness ever reaches, I don't see that political aspect to it ever going away. and somehow this never comes up when you discuss privacy, because you're not talking about, oh, should we provide privacy for this group at the expense of some other group? It's sort of, how much privacy can we get for everyone, or for at least whoever wants it? And fairness is very different that way, in that you always begin the discussion, for the most part, with distinctions between different subgroups or demographics in society and the protections that you're trying to provide to them.
Sarah, let me bring you in. Thoughts, reactions, question?
Sure. First, I just want to give kudos to Michael and Aaron for publishing a book that I think was really accessible, especially for someone like me who is more comfortable in the straight privacy policy regulatory realm than perhaps in some of the issues that are raised about ethics and algorithms. One of the things that really struck me was at the end when you were talking about transparency and interpretability, and that is one of the areas where there's the least scientific research at this point. And I feel that we have sort of a divergence there from policymakers who, in my view, are very focused on the notions of explainability and audibility as being fixes for the privacy and fairness issues that you raised at the beginning, that if we can get to a standard that requires some type of transparency or some type of interpretability, somehow we'll be able to assure that the privacy standards are met or that there's fairness that's been baked in. I'm curious what you think about how the research is going to develop on transparency and interpretability, but also if you had 30 seconds with the policymaker to help dispel that belief, how you would present that to them.
Yeah, so I mean, just to say a little bit about what we talk about in the book is the underlying problems in this area, even though we think it's a very important area. First of all, the very term interpretability, for instance, or accountability, begs the question of interpretability to whom, right? And since we're talking about statistical modeling and machine learning and algorithmic decision making, as we point out in the book, what constitutes an explanation to one person might not constitute an explanation to someone else. And it very much gets to questions about the level of numeracy, for lack of a better term, of the audience you're speaking to. So somebody who has enough statistics training that they know what logistic regression is, might accept one type of explanation or interpretation of a model, whereas somebody who has never completed high school math would not accept that same explanation. So in my opinion, I think the greatest gap in this research area is what I might think of as behavioral studies, sort of really going to different types of groups of people and presenting to them alternative explanations or interpretations of models and decisions, and seeing what they can get out of them. And we know of a small group of people, many of them at Microsoft Research in New York, who are doing interesting research of this variety, but it's super, super early days. And also, having done a little bit of it myself, behavioral research is, it's very, very hard. It's very, very time consuming. It's very slow. And, at the end of the day, you don't learn much that generalizes beyond the specific behavioral experiment and subject pool that you did it on. Aaron, do you have other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, at a higher level, I think it's sort of, you're right that sort of policy folks and legal scholars are focused on these notions of interpretability and explainability, but it's very hard to pin anyone down on exactly what those things mean. And so when you get to the sort of academic literature where people are trying to give interpretable or explainable models, it's the style of research that is proposing solutions sort of without defining what problem they're trying to solve. And it's very easy to get misled this way. So when you look at sort of what people do to try to come up with interpretable image classifiers, for example, they look at often methods that try to highlight parts of the image in the hopes that these parts, that somehow you're learning that this is what the classifier is focusing on in its classification. And there's various methods to do this that, people, when they see them, find convincing, because there's no way to evaluate these things except, like asking people, often just the reviewers of the paper, whether the, whether the picture in front of them looks like a good explanation. But what we've seen is that many of these methods are sort of doing very silly things, just like edge detection, that really have nothing to do with the like underlying process by which the classifier is making its decisions. Often you can like randomize the weights of the classifier or randomize the labels of the training data and not change the sort of purported explanation at all. And this is sort of, in general, a pitfall when you try to solve a problem that you haven't defined. There's no way to like evaluate whether you've done it or not. And so what we've seen, I think, in privacy and partly in fairness as well, is that progress is really driven by good definitions. And I just don't think we have those for interpretability or explainability.
But you did ask for sort of a 30-second elevator pitch for a policy person for why this might be the right thing to focus on, or how one can be misled by demands for transparency. And so I might even suggest that elevator pitch might be derived from the fairness chapter. So many people, for instance, might think that if I showed you a model for making, let's say, lending decisions, and you saw that the model did not use race as an input, for example, or that it used race as an input, but the coefficient on that variable was very, very small, you might think like, oh, okay, so this is a fair model because it's not using race in lending decisions. And as we point out in the fairness chapter, forbidding the use of race in lending decisions might in fact guarantee that you are unfair to the very group that you were hoping to protect. So this is an example where, because we don't have a specification for what interpretable means, and we might use these heuristics like, oh, well, if the model doesn't use race, then it must be fair by race. You can give very, very real, visceral examples of where the opposite is in fact true. And so until we know what we're talking about when we talk about transparency or interpretability, we'll always be subject to this kind of game of whack-a-mole where somebody thinks that, interpretability means one thing, and then you show them some counterintuitive or even, negative example of that phenomenon, and then you have to move on to something else. And so I think that area is still very much in that whack-a-mole period.
Rob, I want to go to you for a minute, but we brought in Catalin Kosovanu, our friend, who had a question. Your mic is open.
Thank you. Excellent book. Really, really enjoyed reading it, and very well calibrated for this audience. And I guess my question is kind of twofold. So first, and very practically, when one thinks about fairness, and you can probably tell that I work for LinkedIn, does one look at the population at large, or does one look more sectorally? And I'll pick a hopefully less politically charged example. Let's say we have a recruiter who wants to fill in a medical nurse position. A very realistic question. Obviously, we do this all the time. And then, okay, do we make sure that the algorithm shows an equal number of men and women? Or do we basically look at the sector and make sure that the algorithm, doesn't do, the same mistake that unfortunately happened with our friends at Amazon, and basically make sure that at least we do not amplify, right, the existing discrepancy, right? And the former, I mean, tongue-in-cheek, kind of ironically speaking, the former option to show kind of equal numbers of men and women, somebody would say, well, okay, that's a action to protect the male minority in the nursing profession. So that's my first question. And the second is about balance between privacy and fairness. So let's say somebody mindful, especially in Europe, mindful of Article 9 of the GDPR, tries to keep away sensitive data, like it's the devil. And it's like, okay, we don't collect this data, we don't hold it, we don't process, we don't do anything with it. And then, which is great from a privacy perspective, trying to be, if in a sense, agnostic about certain sensitive characteristics. But on the other hand, as you were just saying, for fairness purposes, ignorance is not bliss. So then it's a real challenge to kind of reconcile, data minimization while at the same time testing your models to make sure you're not, unfairly harming certain groups. So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Aaron, you want to take one? I'll take one of them. You take the other. Do you have a preference?
Sure, I'll take the first one because I think this is the one where we just punt. So one distinction we try to make in the book, and I think applies here, is that when you think about something like fairness, there's a real difference between the scientific question and sort of the policy question. And the science really can't give you much guidance about the policy question. So the question of what the science can do is once you sort of propose a fairness definition, well, you can think about how you can satisfy it. You can think about what are the costs of satisfying it in terms of other things you care about, like accuracy or other kinds of fairness or privacy. But when you start to ask, okay, well, what are the groups you want to protect? Or these questions like for some application, do I want to make sure that an equal number of candidates are proposed for the job, or do I just want to make sure that the algorithm makes mistakes at comparable rates in different groups? I think there are sort of sensible cases to be made for either of these, right? Like sort of these more affirmative action like policies of equalizing representation, not just equalizing error rates. The case to be made there is either about sort of redressing past wrongs or about changing equilibria, making a temporary intervention so that the pool of applicants changes in the future. But these are not the questions that like computer scientists, for example, are best situated to answer. These are really sort of policy questions that have to be answered with stakeholders and regulators and computer scientists in the room. So it's an important question, but I think it's one that we think, there's not like a single like definitive answer to.
Yeah, and if I understood your second question, I think you're talking about situations in which, let's say a company might have the double burden of not collecting data about race, for example, but also not producing models that are discriminatory by race. And so actually there's a couple of papers on this topic, one of them by us, none of them I think providing super appealing practical solutions at this point. But one solution to a situation like that is to
drink it.
Getting some background noise, I think. So one solution, of course, is to separate the sort of modeling and the auditing functioning, right? So in particular, a company produces a model without the knowledge of racial data, but there's a third party, for instance, a government regulator that holds that racial data, or at least holds racial data on some other population than was used to build the model. Then that third party or governmental regulator could actually audit models for racial fairness or unfairness. And so that's one of the solutions, that's sort of the nature of the solution that we propose, where you would have some sort of iterative process between somebody holding the sensitive data and a party that held other data that was bound to be fair by the sensitive data as well. But I think, these are real problems, and the specific example you mentioned from the GDPR, I think in some ways points out flaws in the thinking around the GDPR, where again, the basic intuition is that somehow by preventing people from accessing sensitive attributes, that you're going to, for free, get fairness by those attributes, and this is just simply not true.
One of the people in our audience here says that their company performs automated hiring interviews. They use AI to stack rank the candidates based on the interview data, the resume analysis, the analysis of the text of the candidates' answers to the interview questions, and are in the middle of this exact use case. Rob, your thoughts, and we will then let our authors go to their next activity and turn to the rest of you to chew it over. Rob's a little more of a technologist than some of us, so curious as to your reaction.
Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed reading the book, and the use case on fairness and traffic route optimization really stood out. The two different outcomes where the outcome with the benefit to the society could have the upper hand. What really stood out as well was this statement in the book. It's a little bit on the last paragraph, it's page 192. And it says that the solution to the problem introduced by algorithmic decision making should in itself be a large part algorithmic. And the reason that you bring forward is that approaches that rely on human oversight either entail largely giving up on algorithmic decision making, or will necessarily be outmatched by the scale of the problem and hence be insufficient. So the question becomes, should we keep the human in the loop? And could we keep the human in the loop? And maybe could it be a design requirement of being able to explain to a human to what extent they are in the loop, or on the loop, or in command? So I'd really love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yes, so maybe I'll go first and then Michael can follow up. So I'd say, like, for sure it's important to keep the human in the loop for, like all of the many reasons we talk about in the book. But although it's sort of necessary to do so, it's not sufficient. So like merely keeping humans in the loop is not a sufficient solution to guarantee that we won't see algorithmic misbehavior, because the kinds of algorithmic misbehavior that we primarily talk about, right, tend not to be the result of sort of malicious intent. And so, like, ethical humans are a necessary but not sufficient condition for ethical algorithms. Even if all of the people in the loop are good moral people, unless we give them the tools to really be able to understand how to intervene in the behavior of decisions made by machine learning algorithms, we will continue to see these kinds of sort of inadvertent and negative side effects of machine learning. And so, I think when we say the solutions need to be in large part algorithmic, like, we're not at all suggesting that we get rid of people. People are very important, but that, like, we need to develop sort of an algorithmic science that can be used as a tool by the people in the loop to sort of constrain the behavior of the algorithms we deploy.
Yeah, I think Aaron said it well. And I would just add that, this question of where in the loop the humans should be, if we are to enjoy the benefits of autonomous decision making by algorithms, i.e., we're not going to, for instance, have every ad that's placed on Facebook, vetted explicitly by a human overseer in every single case. We're not going to have an army of human beings, vetting the search results from every single query that any Google user types in. So obviously, we don't have enough people to do that kind of thing. And so, we live in an era of autonomous decision making by algorithms. They are going to be making decisions without human oversight. And I think what Aaron's pointing out is that it's not enough for the people designing those algorithms to be good people, because good people can design bad algorithms. And you have to do something explicit to avoid the kinds of behaviors that we talk about in the book in the algorithm itself, right? So, one of our main points there, which is a simple one, is that the standard, well-founded, principled methodology of machine learning will result in privacy violations, fairness violations, you name it, without modification. And so, what we're really advocating is figure out what those modifications need to be and to understand them well, so that the things that are operating autonomously have at least some guardrails on them that I think are largely absent today.
So is this really a new question? And by that I mean that let's take the banking industry, which has had to deal with big data, intended, unintended, de facto discrimination just based on lending and housing, and have built checks and balances over the years, and whether it was a complicated program assessing risk or one that technically was machine learning because of a model being used, it feels like the examples that have gotten the public attention have less been the ones that are versions of well-known, legally barred discrimination. The Facebook one is sort of a interesting angle because if an advertiser was clearly buying ads on Facebook and had a big public plan to discriminate, we wouldn't be debating. It's sort of the fact that these tools are there and Facebook has them, and then people are using them. So many of the cases that have been the public debate are ones where it's not clear what the right answer is. The Amazon I think example that we referred to, when I read that, I said, okay, well, it's great that they saw that their algorithm based on their previous hiring was going to be biased, but I'm like, no, actually that means the current hiring is biased because this is what the data shows us people have been making decisions based on, and maybe if you tweaked it, it would be better than the norm. So case after case, we end up perhaps with the fact that people can play with this code and see how it's feeding back results, how it's exposing a whole bunch of ugly, unresolved societal problems, right? The example of the Google search being optimized to show women the middle ranking jobs and not the CEO jobs, because this is what women were responding to. So, do we say to Google, show everyone jobs fairly, and if women don't click on the CEO job, that's not your problem. Your problem is to be fair. And if people don't get the clicks or the campaigns are not effective, you're being fair, as opposed to this is what people are responding to. So, and we don't have a good answer for that, right? We don't have a good answer for the probation case. So it is clearly we need the tools to not be doing these things inadvertently. Clearly, Amazon, whether they use machine learning to determine how to roll out Prime in certain areas, which corresponded to where they had warehouses or speed, but also corresponded to zip codes that were white or wealthy, and then so Amazon nobly says that's not right. We want to do this fairly. But it's clearly the case that another retailer who picks and puts their stores in high income areas because that's where they think they'll make the most money first, and then worries about other areas, might not make that same decision, even though they might in spirit, right? So to some degree, you guys get to come to it and say, hey, we're just building the tools. We don't want people to be surprised. We want you to know and to query. But is it going to be conceivable that we can code for fairness when Congress, regulators, advocates, do not agree on these issues, which is why we don't have laws yet that extend these. So can the code, we're looking to the computer scientists to solve a problem because we want to blame the technology for exacerbating the problem, but society has actually not mandated and given the direction. So I feel like we want you to decide fairness. The coders are like, well, tell us what it is, and then we'll try to align towards it. Are we just going to be going in circles here for forever?
Yeah, so all well said. I think that this is exactly where the action lies, right? And lest this sounds like it's punting on the topic, what I mean by that is, what science can do is get you to the point where it's possible to have a more precise language in which to have the debate, right? So as long as we're discussing algorithmic fairness and nobody has any idea what those two words actually mean. Actually, one of my main problems with the GDPR is that despite its apparent, strength when you just read it on the surface, if you really ask, well, okay, where's the definition of interpretability? Where's the definition of transparency? Where is privacy or fairness defined? It's nowhere. And so the document ends up just sort of, pushing these words around on the pages in, various syntactic combinations without there being any underlying semantic meaning to them. And so what science can do, and what I think the science of differential privacy, and to a lesser extent, the science of algorithmic fairness have done, have at least moved us to the point where we can have more precise conversations about these things. And if policymakers and the like have the appetite to listen and to work with scientists, you can really start to, numerically, quantitatively plot out the trade-offs that you face between, fairness and accuracy, fairness and corporate profitability, this type of fairness versus that type of fairness, the extent to which more fairness by race might force you to have less fairness by gender, for example. All of these are real phenomena, depending on the data set in question. And, I would hazard to say that 10 years ago, we were not even at the point where it was possible to make these debates more precise. Now, that being said, I don't think that the debates in policy and legal circles, as far as I can tell, have yet reached the point where they are taking on this greater level of specificity. But at least the underlying language and methods to do so is there now. And I think we're right at the beginning of a period in which we can and we should have that kind of engagement between the people that do software development and engineering at the big tech companies and lending agencies and the like, and their regulators and the policymakers in that broader circle.
Aaron, you had a final thought?
Yeah, maybe I'll just try to briefly answer the first part of your question. You started off by asking whether these problems are new and whether examples like the Amazon hiring algorithm are just pointing to sort of existing inequities in the human-based systems. And of course, I mean, these problems are not new. There's been discrimination, forever, well before anything was automated. And a lot of what, or part at least of what automation does is it makes sort of quantitative evaluation of the decisions we're making salient, because all of a sudden, you must compute error statistics. But, like the basic impossibility results in fair decision making that we refer to, that you can't simultaneously, equalize your error statistics and your predictive parity across populations. These are just fundamental facts about decision making. They apply equally well to human decision makers as they do to, like automated algorithmic decision makers. It's just that, nobody really had a reason. It was easy to ignore these quantities before we started making decisions in a, the sort of extremely quantitative way that algorithms mandate. And so definitely when you train a machine learning algorithm like the Amazon hiring algorithm on existing decisions made by human HR employees, and you find that the algorithm is biased, it's definitely a sort of red flag that maybe you should revisit the sort of the legacy human hiring process. And so I think in part, the hope is that the algorithmic fairness literature, by all of a sudden studying these things with the level of sort of specificity and rigor that is sort of necessary when you're dealing with algorithms, which are in the end mathematical objects, will sort of give us a lens in which to look at fairness questions even beyond the algorithmic. Because as you say, these problems, many of them are not new.
Thanks, Alpha. Final thoughts, Sarah, Chloe, Rob? I'll take a final question here then from the audience. in the world of ISO and NIST, the first step is to define your terms. In many standards, each organization entity defines what is meant to their product, service, and support organization. So maybe let me take from that, different sectors perhaps might be responding to define what fairness means given their particular stakeholders, because who understands that impact better. So perhaps it's not going to be a central, fairness metric. This could actually be, particularly structured and nuanced, perhaps in the way that, data portability is going to rely on metadata that helps, playlists look like playlists so that others can, export their data. Perhaps indeed at the end of the day, given sort of the softness of the issues, this is something that sectors are going to have to define for themselves. So maybe it's more a final thought than a question. Anyway, we're at the top of the hour. If you didn't buy the book, go buy it. And I'm super thrilled that I had the chance to read it. Hopefully we encouraged you all to read. We'll send out the date. Alyssa will coordinate the next book. If anybody has something that is on their shelf, one of the goals of our effort here was to take all the books that many of us buy, like that, and know we ought to be reading to be sophisticated in our thinking, but sometimes need a deadline or a push, or at least a chance to chat with some peers. So thank you for the book, Michael, Aaron, and I also, these folks have some really useful work. Please go to SSRN, and some of their other papers, both together and separate, are worth a look if you're somebody who follows a lot of the intersection of technology and policy issues. So anyway, stay safe, everybody, and we'll talk to you next month. And if you've got any good ideas for a book, I'll leave the chat open for a minute. And if not, Alyssa is going to email everybody as always, and look for suggestions for something that is at the top of your list. So Chloe, Michael, Eric, Aaron, Rob, Sarah, thank you. Everybody who joined us remotely. We had about 50, 60 people with us. So thanks, and on to your next Zoom call.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks,
Thanks
everybody.
Jules. Thanks both Michael and Aaron. This was great. Great selection.
Thanks everybody for the great questions. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. This was great.
Thanks a lot.
Bye all. Thank you.